Hi, my name is Bart.
My name is Lewis. We are two pilots with a passion for history.
Welcome to our channel, High on History. Welcome to our second episode of High on History.
Yes, we are here at Les Halles of Saint Gery in the heart of Brussels, which used to be back in the day an island on the River Seine.
If you live in Brussels today, you wouldn't notice much of this, as the river is now fully underground.
Yes, however, in this private courtyard, which lies behind the restaurant Le Lion d'Or, you can see the river, the Seine, today.
Nearby, we would have found a small harbor and a bridge during the Celtic and Roman times. If you would have looked around, you would have seen dispersed rural settlements without a real center.
Brussels wasn't even depicted on the Roman road maps. This scattered settlement continued through the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties.
So, how and when did Brussels become a real place of importance, a city? We are here to find out.
Welcome, Professor Bram Vannieuwenhuyze, to High on History. Thank you for coming.
No problem.
Would you be so kind to introduce yourself to me and to the the viewers?
I will be so kind, yes. Hello, I'm Bram Vannieuwenhuyze. I am professor by special appointment in historical cartography at the University of Amsterdam, meaning that I study and teach on the history of cartography and on old maps, for instance, old maps of Brussels. And in the past, some 15 years ago, I studied the medieval history of Brussels, the origins of Brussels.
Perfect. And that's why we contacted you, because we have some questions
Exactly.
about the birth of Brussels.
Yeah.
So before we start the interview, I want to take a step back, maybe let the viewers know and you where we are on the timeline. So with Professor Wandenbol, we discussed the prehistory, the Romans. Then with Brit class, we discussed the Merovingians. And now we're coming to the Frankish period with Charles Martel, his son, Pepin the Short, his son, Charlemagne. So my first question to you was, Charlemagne, big figure, did he signify anything for Brussels or not really?
Not exactly, or not directly. So we don't have any proof, or we don't have any proof that he has ever been here. And what's more, we don't have any clear and direct proof of a settlement in Brussels. So, for the moment, most historians and archaeologists think that the city of Brussels originated somewhere in the 10th century.
So the year 900, some 50
Yeah.
something.
Nevertheless, there's a name, the old name, place name Brussels, Bruxelles, and linguists, they say, or they think, because there are no hard proof, that this name originated somewhere in the 7th to the 10th century. So that can be the period of Charlemagne, of course, but it can also be a century later. And if there was something, it was very small. It was a very small settlement.
Okay.
Not a city like we know it today.
So to conclude, it's not a really pinpoint date, it's a bit of a vague period.
Yeah, it's very
And
vague.
you mentioned this village, so was Brussels like one village with a wall around it, or was it like a patchwork of different, what do you think?
Well, in that period, we only have the name, Bruxelles. So the name consists of two parts. You have Ruok. It's an old German word, which means brook in Old Dutch, swamp in English. So it's the area here nearby the Seine, river, a small river. And then you have the other compound of the name, Sala. And there you have two or many theories, and some people say that it means a castle or a kind of fortification or a residence of a nobleman. But on the other hand, you have also people who say that it's just a cabin in the swamp, so very very small. So it depends on one of both theories that you adhere to.
So there are many theories, and nobody knows exactly.
So, and if it was a cabin nearby the swamp or in the swamp, it was of very less importance. little importance. If it was a castle or fortification, then of course cellar had some importance, but not that big that for instance Charlemagne or one of his descendants passed here or did something here.
So to conclude again, Brussels didn't really have much significance or power during that period.
No, not at all.
Okay. And you mentioned the swamp, the Zenne. Behind us we have the Halles of Saint Gery. I have read, and Bart as well, that the castle was here. Do you agree with that, or you have a different?
I have read that too. But the oldest mention of that story dates back to the 14th century, and the story itself should have happened in the 10th century. So meaning that the story has been written down 400 years later. Nowadays, most historians, I think, and I'm one of them, don't believe that story anymore because we don't have any direct proof of the genesis, the cradle of the city here.
So what do you believe in? Where do you think it was?
I believe in a theory that other colleagues of mine have also already put forward. That's the theory of dispersed settlements, some kind of patchwork of settlements of small importance which grew together, and together they became a city. That's why Brussels also became important, I guess, because they grew together.
I did some research also into this, and I think for instance, Molenbeek was a little village, Vilvoorde, and you think that these little villages, they came together, they created a wall around it?
I do not mean villages like Molenbeek, Vilvoorde, Anderlecht, but I mean settlements here in the city center.
Okay.
So, for instance, here on this spot nearby the Senne, you had a kind of small settlement with a port, with water mills, for instance, so with industry, with merchants. But you have also a very small settlement nearby St Gudula's church. Yep. So there was ecclesiastical power, you can say. Here it was more industrial and commercial power. And then you had here nearby St Géry. Yep. And then you had another small settlement on the Coudenberg, where the Lord was, where the residence of the Lord was. So these are all examples of these small settlements which grew together inside the cities. And
makes sense. And then you mentioned some churches. I mean, quite a hard question, but you have the church of, I'm just going to look at my sheet here.
No problem.
There's a lot of them. St. Jacob of Coudenberg, you have the one, St. Gudula, which you mentioned, the Kapellenkerk, Anderlecht, Molenbeek. Again, I've done some research. Do you know the oldest church, or were really the...
Well, the general theory is that St. Gudula's church is the oldest.
The cathedral, right?
The cathedral. Yeah, nowadays a cathedral, but at that time it was only called the church, St. Gudula's church. It only became a cathedral afterwards. But there are also indications, and to my opinion even proofs, that St. Gudula church made itself important. So they became the mother parish of Brussels. They call it like that. And the mother parish was above all other churches. Does that mean that St. Gudula was also the oldest one? There are some indications, but we don't have hard proofs yet. But we know that there was a small wooden church before, not named St. Gudula's church, but St. Michael's church.
St. Michael's, even older.
Even older, but probably in wood. And now you have the stone St. Gudula church, or the stone St. Gudula's cathedral. So the wooden church dedicated to St. Michael, we don't have any traces of it, and we don't know how old it was, the importance it had. But perhaps that can or could have been the first church attached to this small settlement, Oksala.
Okay.
But this is just hypothesis.
Again, talk about hypothesis. We mentioned here the Halles of Saint Gery. You mentioned before the interview that there were also maybe a little church.
Yes, it was also a church, and I just told you about St. Gudula's church who made itself important. Well, there are stories written by monks or canons, I must say, some religious people from St Gudula's church who wrote down that the remains of St Gudula were first here at St Géry, but that they were not taken care of, and that they transferred it to St Gudula. So it was a kind of manner to say St Géry not good at all. Just we take the remains of St Gudula. This is a very better and more important church. So
makes it hard work for you historians to see what's going on. I can imagine. Okay, perfect. Then another question. You know this. When did Brussels get its status as city? You know, you have a specific date when it got like a letter maybe from someone saying Brussels is now officially a city?
Cannot put a date on it, but there are the first indications of a settlement of some importance and kind of future as a city are in the 11th century, but the real takeoff as a city is the 13th century, because then you have an urban government, then you have the first stone wall around the city, then you have a town charter, they have their own representatives. So in the 13th century we can clearly say Brussels promotes itself as a city, and it's also seen as a city by the landlord. And in the period before, it's gradually growing to that period.
And how did Brussels compare to its competitors like Leuven, Ghent, Bruges? Because I think these cities are a lot older than Brussels. You have to compete against
they are older and also more important in that period. So Brussels is in that period is of less importance than, for instance, Leuven, where the Dukes of Brabant came from.
And the Dukes of Brabant, do they rule Brussels, or how does this work?
Well, they first ruled Leuven and its environment, and afterwards they also settled down in Brussels, and they took Brussels and they joined both territories. Okay. But at a certain time, Brussels became more important, more bigger population, more commercial liftoff. So Brussels took the first position.
I see.
But in the period we are talking about, it was Leuven that was the first city of Brabant.
I see. All right. So again, just to conclude, Brussels was a little village. It grew over time. Let's talk about the people in Brussels. First of all, what language did they speak in that time?
Well, of course, I'm an historian, so I have studied texts, and the texts we have from that period are all in Latin. But Latin was, of course, the language of the people from the church, the intellectuals, and that was only 1% of the population. So the other 99% of the population spoke Dutch, Old Dutch, medieval Dutch.
Flemish?
No, Flemish is, of course, the language of the county of Flanders. Here it's Brabant, so it was a Brabant dialect they spoke. But of course, these languages are affiliated to each other. But it was Dutch, medieval Dutch that they spoke here in Brussels.
Nobody speaks that today anymore. You don't find this dialect anymore, I guess.
Well, the Brabant dialect today is, of course,
closest relative.
It's relative to the dialect in that period. But there are lots of words that we don't use anymore.
And today the Senne, as most of us know, is covered by earth. Back then it was open. Now with COVID-19 and all this poor year we had, back then I guess there were also some pandemics, something about Black Death, cholera, stuff like this.
Well, the same story as with the flooding. So there must have been, for sure, epidemics, pandemics. We don't know that there are no clear proofs or evidence that the Black Death has touched Brussels, but there must have been other problems like this kind. And again, we have the measures taken by the city government. So different kind of measures in order to, sanitary laws, for instance, against pollution by industrial activities.
What kind of industries are you thinking of? Like, I'm thinking of fisheries, or was it more making clothes, or what did people live on?
Brussels, like many of other cities in the Low Countries, like Ghent, for instance, also like Leuven, like Mechelen, was very depended very much on its textile industry. So many of the craftsmen working in the textile industry, for instance, dyers, tanners, these were very polluted activities. So the stonemasons were also pushed to the outside. because these were also polluting activities.
So I can already think that life back then was very hard, filthy. What did the area around here look like?
Well, here we are near St Géry. We are, of course, next to the Seine. So this was the area that, in the first place, was touched by these floodings, also by diseases, by these epidemics, because we are here in the downtown, where
economic heart, let's say.
Yeah, it was the industrial part of the city. So the elite was, of course,
nice and dry at the castle.
Uptown, and downtown were the laborers, all these polluting activities. So life was much more hard here. There was a stank, there was poverty, criminality. But on the other hand, you had also open spaces. So you must not think about Brussels as a city full of very narrow streets with no sunlight. So it was more at some time that there were problems, and other times it was things went good. There was also prosperity because Brussels became important, so there was also prosperity.
A bit different than the cities like London or Paris. Brussels.
Well, I would not say so different. The image that many people have and that you evoke now is kind of image from the 19th century, from the 20th century. So in reality, there are more indications that it was more balanced than that everything was bad.
Okay. Now, I mentioned the French, I mentioned the English. The biggest enemies, did Brussels get invaded by someone? I'm thinking of maybe Vikings or Spaniards, stuff like this.
Brussels got invaded, but not by the people you
know.
You evoke. So the problems or the conflicts were more local or regional. So Brussels has been invaded, for instance, by the Flemish, by the Count of Flanders, so by the people from Ghent, Bruges in the 14th century.
And why did they do this?
Well, because the Count of Flanders and the Duke of Brabant, they were opposing powers at some times. So in the middle of the 14th century, for instance, there was conflict on the inheritance of the Brabant seat, throne. So the Count of Flanders wanted to take it, so he invaded Brussels. So it were not the Vikings and the Huns and more the Germans and the Englishmen. It were more local conflicts. Also inside Brussels, you had conflicts between the elite and the working class people. So there were revolts against city government, revolts against the noblemen, the elite, against the duke. So these were more the problems where Brussels was facing. Not.
It is a nice introduction to the future of Brussels, which will be discussed with Aula Magna. Last question before we leave. This period, let's say from 800 to 1200. If a tourist comes to Brussels, will he find any remains from this period?
Yes, but they are in disguise, let's say. So you still have the places, like here, St Géry. There was a medieval church, but now it's a 19th century market hall. And also the tangible traces from that period, you must also enter buildings before you can discover them. But for instance, at St Gudula's Cathedral, there you have the oldest remains of the Roman St Gudula's Church from the 11th century. But you must enter the building and then go downstairs. Coudenberg Castle, that's the same story. There you have also remains from the 12th century. But you must enter the building and discover these remains inside. You cannot see them in open space.
Can we see the outer wall? Is that maybe still?
Can we see
the outer wall that was around?
The 13th century city wall from 13th century, stone city wall. There you have lots of remains scattered in the city center, and you have also one big remain of the second city wall. That's the Hallepoort, up to the Hall.
Very famous.
That's the 14th century fortification.
It's two walls.
Two stone walls.
But one is the old one and one was built later on.
The first one, 13th century, is the the old one, and then 14th century. Then you have the second city wall of Brussels with the Hallepoort, which is now the La Petite Ceinture, the Kleine Ring. And previously there were perhaps older walls, but no traces of it left.
And then to jump ahead to the next episode, what is the next step for Brussels? Let's finish at 1250. What area are we going to go into? You mentioned these conflicts between people in Brussels. Can you maybe mention something about this? What comes next?
Well, from the 13th century onwards, Brussels promotes itself as a city, is seen as a city, and from that moment on, it will take over the power from Leuven, of the most important city of Brabant. And then you have, of course, the 15th century with the coming of the Dukes of Burgundy, and in the 16th century of the Habsburg lords, Charles V and Philip II. That's Brussels is then seen as a kind of capital city of very large territory. So that's
the future of Brussels.
That has been built in the centuries before that we were discussing.
Professor Vannieuwenhuyze, I want to thank you for talking to us today.
No, thanks.
And,
it was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Once again, thank you to Professor Vannieuwenhuyze to talk to us about the early medieval ages in Brussels.
As we keep going up the timeline, we are now approaching the late Middle Ages in Brussels, and this is really where the city starts to manifest itself.
Yes, that's true. For example, we see the birth of the Grand Place, Mannekepis and the cathedral. Brussels becomes a place of political importance.
We've contacted a good friend of ours, Adam Hall, who's done extensive research in this period. And we're going to discover the mysteries, the wonders and the problems of the city during the late Middle Ages. We're here at the Museum of the Palace of Coudenberg to find out more.
Welcome, Adam Hall. Many thanks for being on High on History. Could you please be so kind to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm a PhD researcher here in Brussels, and I specialize in medieval commercial history.
We would like to continue where we left off with Professor Vannieuwenhuyze, which was Brussels. Brussels was about to be on the path to become a city. We covered the period up until approximately the year 1200. My first question to you is, when and how did Brussels become a city?
Well, Brussels received its town charter in 1229, which meant that it got privileges, basically meaning that it was a semi-autonomous government of its own. It could promulgate its own customary laws, and it could administer its own justice in its jurisdiction. And this happened under the Duke of Brabant, Henry I, who, as it happened, also started constructing the famous cathedral of St Michael and St Gudule, which is symbolically also a sign often for a city, a grand cathedral.
What was daily life like in Brussels during the late medieval period?
Well, you need to imagine tapestries and trade with the rest of Europe, but also specifically with Brussels' breadbasket, the Seine Valley, and the Pajottenland specifically. You should imagine a growing city. Brussels reached several tens of thousands of people during the High Middle Ages. And with that expansion came also a port and a canal, making it easier for Brussels to connect itself to the urbanizing and commercializing hinterlands of Brabant and Flanders, and specifically also later on the bigger cities of Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp. At the same time, later in the period, the Burgundian dukes would start turning the city into a sort of administrative proto-capital of the Low Countries, and with that the city also develops an economy geared towards the luxurious lifestyle that the Burgundian dukes were quite famous, or some would say infamous for. But with that we also need to say that a lot of people lived in squalor. Brussels has an infamous river, the Seine, which during the course of its history expanded beyond the bounds beyond its natural bounds, and with that also the effects of it being a natural sewage system for the city meant that very often people lived in quite horrible circumstances.
That brings me to my next question. People often say that there were poor hygienic conditions in Brussels, as it was a swampy area. Is this true? And looking back from the COVID-19 pandemic, were there any epidemics or pandemics at that time?
Well, it certainly is true that people, especially lower classes, would live in squalor. At times, though, we exaggerate the way this would have looked like in the Middle Ages, you know, the whole term, the Dark Ages. And specifically on, for instance, the plague, there was the plague in these parts between 1346 and 1353. And we estimate between 1/3 and half of Europe perished in that pandemic. Well, we're not really sure what happened in these parts, in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands and Belgium. We don't have much quantitative data about that. What we do know, and we know this for the rest of Europe as well, is that the plague recurred over centuries, so it came back. And in Brussels, in the 17th century specifically, between 1667 and 1670, there was a particularly nasty episode of the plague, the Yersinia pestis, coming back, and people were put into plague houses. So we complain about having been confined in a quarantine and so forth, but people were actually forced into plague houses back in the day. So maybe that puts some things into perspective. Also, the little fact that not half of us died during COVID is an important thing to note.
Well, when people visit Brussels today, they automatically think about the beautiful Grand Place. It's a very famous square. It's for sure people want to visit if they visit Brussels. My question to you is, could you tell us more about the Grand Place and its origins?
Yeah, well, at first, obviously, if you come here as a visitor, you notice that the decoration is beautiful. It's extravagant. At times, it's eclectic. And there's a reason for that. The origins are very much high medieval, as the neighbouring, which suggests a more humble, general wholesaler's market. Yet the architecture we see is a bit later. It's from the early modern period. Now what happens in between is a bombardment by the French. So instead of purely medieval architecture, we see a mix between Gothic and Baroque. And what we really see is the influences of the craft guilds. Now the craft guilds in Brussels, especially during the Burgundian period, gain a lot of wealth, they gain a lot of power, and they use that to develop the square and to show off their own wealth. And at the same time, the city as well develops its own administrative institutions and buys up parts of the city around the square and really builds up these grandiose buildings. And one of them is, the most famous one is called the Broodhuis, which was used in a way for the city to really manage the expanding markets that were jumping up in this period.
How did the Grand Place evolve in what people see today?
So specifically when we go to the Grand Place, the first thing we see is the City Hall. It's the most imposing building on the square. And it really starts off as a stone building called the Mairie, which is published by the city government for administrative purposes, but also to facilitate the growing textile trade, which Brussels will become famous for and still is. And it will have a specific lac in Halle to make it easier for people to sell these goods under any conditions. What then happens is the city constructs and builds more houses around the square in a Gothic style. And in this period, as I mentioned before, especially during the Burgundian period, the city guilds go from strength to strength, and at some point they gain the right to sit on the city council, and they start constructing their own guild houses to really compete with the city. Usually in Flanders we see this competition between the city in architectural style and the church, with the famous belfries and the cathedrals. In Brussels we see these guild houses competing a little bit with the city government. So that's incredibly interesting, and that eclectic but beautiful decorative rivalry, we still see that today.
Was Brussels able to rule itself?
Brussels, well, at least in the Low Countries in general, even though it was as commercialized and arguably maybe more economically developed at some point than the famous city-states of Italy, they were never truly independent. They got privileges, they got self-rule in the fact that they could manage their own city markets, but this was still very much reliant on the ruling prince, be that the Duke of Brabant, the Duke of Burgundy, or the Habsburg region. So they did not have their own autonomous assembly politics.
What is the origin of the Coudenberg Palace?
The Coudenberg, as the name suggests, was originally a hill overlooking the city of Brussels. And it originated, at least the construction here originated as a fortress, a castrum, in the 12th century, which was later expanded into a sort of administrative palace by the several ruling dynasties, the House of Brabant, the Dukes of Burgundy, and the Habsburg regions.
Then why was the Coudenberg Palace such an important place? Why was it so special?
Well, we should consider the Coudenberg Palace both politically and symbolically, especially during the Burgundian period again, Brussels starts taking on a more central role, an administrative role for the Burgundian realm, which stretched from parts of Burgundy in France through the Low Countries, through Brabant and Flanders, up into the Netherlands that we know today. And so it was also a place where the Dukes of Burgundy could not only reside and rest, but mostly actively be engaged in politics, receive diplomats, receive other princes, and also do a sort of propaganda. Tapestries, banquets, heraldry, the Knights of the Order of the Golden Fleece, which is the most important knightly order in the Burgundian realm, they would gather here. So symbolically, politically, very much a center within the center of the Burgundian realm, which is in a way Brussels.
What would people imagine the Magna Aula to be like?
A beautifully decorated, welcoming entrance. Lots of color. If you're lucky enough to see a banquet, you'd probably see a pie with pigeons coming out and imposing you with just the magnitude of how wealthy the Burgundian realm was. So that was the intention as well of the Aula.
Who was Charles V and why was he so important to the Coudenberg Palace and Brussels?
Charles V, in a way, is a giant among giants in the history of the Low Countries. He was originally born and raised in Ghent, so he probably understood some Dutch. And he is really the world's first truly global emperor. He was emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he was also king of Spain, and with that obviously came the colonial possessions in the New World, but also the possessions in Sicily, in Italy, in now what we know as Germany, the Czech Republic, and so on. So he was truly the first global emperor. And he expanded and saw the Coudenberg Palace as one of those venues where, as you mentioned earlier, you could welcome guests, you could really impress them, you could do diplomacy. So he would, for instance, help construct the chapel here. So there's very much part of a symbolic propaganda agenda for Charles V.
Why do a lot of people in Brussels today don't know about the Coudenberg Palace?
So what's interesting about this, I mean, it's a magnificent archaeological site. It's probably one of the best preserved that I've seen. The problem is that it is situated in a part of the city where there's already a lot to see. And with seeing, I mean that literally. So we're right next to the Royal Palace, we're right next to the Bellevue Museum. We've got a beautiful royal park here with the House of Representatives and the Senate. We've got the Mont des Arts, the Royal Library, museums. So there's a lot here that people see by just looking around, whereas this is underground, so it's quite hidden. And it's sad because the Coudenberg Palace was known to be a magnificent palace back in the day.
You mentioned that the Coudenberg Palace burned down, so where we are now, that's fully underground. People wonder, are there any other sites they can still visit in Brussels that have a reference to the late medieval period?
Yes, there are quite a few, and one of these, in fact, is the Hallepoort, which used to be, the name suggests a gate, but it's actually, at the moment, it looks like a watchtower. And it also served as a prison in Brussels and is now a museum, so it's quite emblematic of how these structures, their functions change over time. And more importantly, it was part of two walled encirclements of Brussels. As the city expanded, it needed more and more walls. And some of these walls you can still see throughout the city. Most famously close to what is now the Sablon, you can find one. At the same time, there's also the quite famous little statue of the boy pissing, Manneken Piss. That one is still famously in the city and has medieval origins. And if I may, I'll go back to the Grand Place again. The City Hall, at the top of the City Hall, you'll find a statue of the patron saint of Brussels, Saint Michael, the famous archangel who fights Lucifer in the rebellion of the angels. And he's very much a symbol of Brussels' ability to overcome destitution and recover. And he will be, usually in the Low Countries, be portrayed as slaying a dragon.
One more question is the May tree tradition. Could you tell a bit more about that?
The May tree or the Meiboom seems to be an older European tradition. And specifically, it seems to have survived here in Brabant, in the cities of Brussels and Leuven. Both have this tradition of planting a tree in the month of August. And the origin, at least in Brussels, seems to in a way commemorates some kind of battle or some kind of fight between Brussels and Leuven, which Brussels happened to have won. But these days, it's mostly really just a folkloristic revival, really about celebrating Brussels in the lovely summer and its lovely ambiance. Just as, for instance, the Ommegang, which celebrates the entry of Charles V into the city. Or the floral carpet in Brussels. It's really about folkloristic celebration of Brussels' past, its present, and hopefully to continue these traditions in the future.
Thank you, Adam Hall, for being on Higher History.
I was very happy to do this.
Adam is keigoed, man.
Voilà, faut pas avoir peur de laisser un petit commentaire hein, sur les vidéos. À quoi ça sert que moi je fais tout ça? Ben de lourrique, bande de fainéants, un petit commentaire, c'est bien, c'est pas bien, je m'en fous, faire me kluten doen, liep naar de duivel, n'importe quoi quand même. Gooi, oi, oi.